So I think we'll start with Rhoda. So Rhoda's been a part of the gig for some time, and she'll present on how I created my surname book. Uh, Rhoda Olsrud Mackenzie is a member of the Sons of Norway who lives in a retirement community, Asbury Methodist Village in Gaithersburg, Maryland. She self-published a book of Norwegian family history. When we first were putting this information together, we wanted to say that she was the author of this book, but she protested and said, and I couldn't even get her to take the title of editor. So, but we've heard about this book before, and I think it was quite an undertaking. So, do you want to take it away?
Well, that's why I called it How I Created My Surname Book, because I didn't think of myself as an author, and a lot of other people did help me with the information that I included in my book. So thanks for inviting me to share my story with you. I'm not an expert on researching or writing family history, and I had never even heard of a surname book until a couple of years ago when Alexis Steen spoke to us, and she was telling us about different resources that most people didn't know much about. And she said a lot of people in Norway were writing surname books. And she held up a little paperback book, and I was just kind of dumbfounded because I said, when we had a chance to respond to her, I said, you know, I've never heard of a surname book, but I wrote one. And so I showed her this book, and her book with a different title looked a lot like it. And I was just very surprised to find out that actually what I had created really, I think, can be called a surname book, because I included everything I could find out about this family in the book. So then later she contacted me with email and asked me to do a presentation for you. And she said she'd like to know how I decided to pursue writing a book. Well, I had no idea I would be producing a book when I began collecting family history. So this is how I wrote a surname book without even knowing it. It happened like this. My parents lived in North Dakota, and I lived in Massachusetts at that time. And on one of our summer visits, my father showed my young sons an old coffee mill that he said he was the only object he possessed that came from Norway with his immigrant father's family. And it had been made by an uncle of his grandfather, who was a blacksmith in the early 1800s. The picture shows my father demonstrating the coffee mill to my two little boys. I hadn't seen it before or known about it. I think he got it from his older sister. Well, he was 86 years old, and I realized that I didn't know much about his family. So I asked him if he would just write down the names of his parents, grandparents, and anything he knew about them. They had died before I was born, his parents. And then I thought, well, I'd like to learn more about his early life too. So he said, well, how about if I make a tape recording? So that's what he did. And he sent me the tape in 1976. So that's when I got started. And the next year, I asked my mother to do the same thing. So she made a tape recording, and they each talked to relatives ahead of time before making the recording to get information. And they had been to Norway and visited relatives and compared stories with them as well. So it was sometime later, years passed, and I finally decided to transcribe these two tape recordings so I could have a written form of their stories and include some photographs and anything else I could find out about the family. And I had a lot of questions, like how to spell the names, Norwegian names that they had mentioned. And so my sister, Lois, volunteered to do some follow-up interviews. So she was a big helper in putting together this family history. And then it was about 1998 when I thought, what am I going to do with all this material that I've gathered in my filing cabinet? I thought, you know, I have enough material to write a book, but just the thought of writing a book was intimidating. I just couldn't imagine how I would organize or write about all this information. And then I thought, well, I would just let people tell their stories in their own words. I would just use the transcription of the tape recordings, and later on I got other people to tell their stories and put it together. I thought it would be nice to have a book that kind of read like a novel, and just people telling their own stories. But then I did add a lot of other information eventually. So I imagine most of you have used the same kind of information that I had in putting together your family histories. I discovered that my older brother had been collecting material such as my father's World War I journals and some old letters that my dad had translated from Norwegian. And my brother also had some newspaper stories. A relative wrote a newspaper column called In the Good Old Days, and my father's sister had contributed a couple of stories to that column. So that told about the immigrants who came from Norway. And then a friend told me about Cindy's List. I don't know if you know about that, but that's a link that gives you a lot of different sources to explore. And living in Bethesda by that time, I went to the Library of Congress and did some research there and searched the International Genealogical Index online, and even found a few local history books that mentioned relatives. So this picture of the two little notebooks that were kept by my dad when he was in the Army in World War I. The second one I opened to the page where he tells about coming back to New York from France and was met by the Mayor's Committee and the Red Cross, and he lists other organizations that met them at that time. While I was thinking about how to create a book out of all this, I came across a quote from Ole Rolvag, who wrote Giants in the Earth. And I'd read that before starting this project. I was struck by how similar my own family's experience was to the story he told about Norwegian immigrants. And then I found out that he was one of my father's professors at St. Olaf College. So I decided to use this quote at the beginning of the book. He said, "It is vital in all cultural life to maintain a link between the present and the past. If there is anything that history makes clear, it is this, that when a people becomes interested in its past life and seeks to acquire knowledge in order better to understand itself, it always experiences an awakening of new life." So I wasn't sure what awakening of new life to expect, but actually some unexpected things have occurred as a result of reading books of family history. And then another source of inspiration for creating a book came from a little book my mother gave me. It was written by her grandfather, who came from Scotland to America with his family when he was a child in 1835. He researched his family history and he wrote the history of the Scott and Bryson families. This small hardcover book was published by his brother. John Scott Bryson, in the introduction of his book, expressed the hope that his descendants would continue writing the family history. So I asked if anyone was doing this, and I was told a couple of people had written something about themselves or their parents, but no one had really tried to follow his descendants. He had 6 children. So to fulfill his hope, I researched and prepared a book about the descendants of John Scott Bryson. He had researched and written about both his mother and his father, as well as his siblings, but I decided I had enough material for 2 books. And then I ended up doing an update of the book that he wrote, because I did a lot of research on things he referred to and included things like political parties and Civil War battles that he mentioned. So the picture shows his original book, the update I did, and then the book about his descendants. My grandmother came to live with my family when I was a child, and she hung a picture on the wall of her bedroom. And that's the picture down below on the left. And the man in the white beard is John Scott Bryson, and his wife, Tilda, came from Norway. And then there's 6 children. One was my grandmother, one was her the youngest sister was named Rhoda, and she was the one for whom I was named Rhoda, but she died before I was born, so I never knew her. But the next picture shows my family when I was 5 years old, and I'm the little Rhoda at the right, just as the little Rhoda was at the right in the first picture. So pictures like this made me feel a connection with my family, and I was curious to learn more about them. Alexis asked me how I arranged how I organized the contents. So I just showed you here my contents page. I started with acknowledgements because I thought it was important to recognize that a lot of people had contributed to the information I included. And then I wrote an introduction to tell how I ended up putting this together in a book. And then I included 30 pages of photographs. I just photocopied them. I borrowed some from relatives and sent them back. And I decided to call the book Olsrud Stories because I thought if this book ever ends up in a library and people want to learn about the family Olsrud, that's what they'll look for. So I wanted the book to start with that name. And that was their family farm, Olsrud, in Norway. When they came to America, then they chose that as their surname. Yeah, I think. I'm showing you a few examples of the pages. The picture pages started with, I called it an Olsrud family picture album, and dedicated it to my mother and father and showed them on their 50th wedding anniversary. And then starting with the oldest generation that I had pictures of, it shows my great-grandfather in the white beard and 2 of his sons. The one on the right is my grandfather Hans and his wife, my grandmother Christina, but they also had died before I was born, so I never knew them. The picture below them is the farm in Norway where my grandmother grew up in Stenberg. And below that, you see a page with my father in his World War I uniform. And below that, you see him at the bottom. I'm demonstrating the coffee mill. And then the next page is my generation, shows myself and my little brother. This is chapter 1. And I thought it would be helpful to have a main character to tie the stories together. So I would identify each person as they were related. I decided to call my father the main character of the book, since I really started with the tape recording that he made about his family. And so this chapter really is just the transcript of the tape recording, but I wrote a very brief introduction. I wrote, here in his own words is the story of Oscar Olsrud's ancestry and early life as he recorded it. Information inserted in brackets was provided by him or his sister Anna at other times. Anna often added different details to stories that Oscar told. So I did occasionally insert other information. And I did, you'll see in brackets, put some pronunciation guides to some of the Norwegian names. And then we'll go on to the next page. So instead of putting endnotes, I made instead of doing footnotes, I made endnotes. Just click on it. It started scrolling on us, but you'll see that endnote number 3 is about the coffee mill. And if I'd put that in the body of the book, it would have taken up most of the space on the first page. So I put all the notes at the end of the book. I felt it was really important to document carefully all the information because I thought if people read this and think it's just hearsay, stories passed on from one person to another, they won't know how much is true. So I tried to tell exactly where I got each bit of information. This is the chapter then on the immigrants. And again, I just wrote a brief introduction, and in identifying people, I tried to put in the birth date and death date. Most of the times the reader would be able to keep track of, the time period in which this person lived. So I wrote very little has been passed down to our generation about the Olsrud family before they left Norway, but we can learn some things from census and other records. Old parish records were researched by a genealogist in Norway to correct and add to some of Oscar's information. So I did consult genealogists, both on my mother's side and my father's side of the family. And most of this information in the first paragraph just came from the census. And, it was interesting. The Norwegian census in 1865 had a lot of details. So I was able to learn that on his little farm, he had 2 horses, 5 cattle, 6 sheep, and a pig, and raised barley, oats, and potatoes. So then I used Family Tree Maker in compiling the ancestry charts. And here I put the names in red. I didn't have them in red in the book, but that just shows you which people came to America. And so I just traced the family only a couple of generations back from that. It's possible I could have gone back further, but that would have been a lot harder, I think. And I did put footnotes in this section because I just wanted to have the basic information in the chart with births and deaths and marriages. But if I had other information like baptisms and census information, I just put that in a footnote. And then I decided to create a timeline. I made about 3 pages here, just so that, like, my kids and people reading the book would have an idea of how this family fit in with the rest of history that they knew about. So I put in italics the information from just general history or the history of Norway. The first item says, from 1380 to 1814, Norway was ruled by the King of Denmark. So, I thought it was important for them to realize that. And then I put in bold print when the ancestors that I traced came along, and then put the information about their births. So then I was asked about the time commitment for writing and editing. And, I didn't keep track of my time. I collected information over many years. And then when I finally decided to do books, I ended up with these 3 books, and I really worked on them simultaneously. So it's hard to say how much time I spent on my Surname book. But when I finally decided to create books, I think I did spend probably a couple of hours a day, most days, maybe up to 4 hours for a period. And then did the update on my great-grandfather's book first, and then worked on the Olsrud stories. And then the last one I did was the descendants of John Scott Bryson, because there were a lot of relatives to contact, and that took longer to get that put together. Well, I just played around on my computer, figuring out how I would like a book to look, and I knew nothing about publishing or how other people created books. I didn't know anyone else writing books at that time. I went to the library and looked at other family histories, and what I wanted to do was really different from anything else I found. But my husband had done some writing through his work, and so he suggested that we contact a publisher that he knew in Washington and just make an appointment and tell them what I wanted to do. So I had my book on a disc, took it to them and told them, I wanted it to look exactly the way I had formatted it. I wanted a small paperback book, and so I had formatted it with 2 pages on a 8.5, 11 sheet of paper. And I thought, if it's a small book and lightweight paperback, you can take it along when you visit relatives, because there's a lot of information in the book that you might want to refer to. And so then they said that wasn't usually the way they published books, but they could do that. They could just print it out and photocopy the pages. They had to cut the 2 pages apart in order to organize them for binding. But they showed me some samples of cover paper, and I just chose inexpensive covers of different colors and designed the covers. And got about 30 copies made of the Olsrud book and 50 copies of the others, because there were more relatives on my mother's side that I had identified. And I guess I got 35 copies and sent out about 30. So I had a few left over. And I have given away a couple of them and intend to give away a few more to local family or local historical societies. And actually one was donated this past year to the county in Minnesota where my father was born. So the last question I was asked was about examples of appreciation. So I've just included one thank you note here. I did give thank yous for most of the books I sent out. And this is from a woman who's the mother of my niece's husband. And they're a Jewish family, but the son lent the book to his mother, and she wrote, "I really enjoyed the Olsrud family history that you put together this past year. I was touched by so many of the stories, the struggles, and how they were overcome. You did a good job." So I was, appreciated the fact that the book was read and appreciated by someone who wasn't even a member of the family. And then more recently, I was contacted by a niece, and she said that a farmer, had contacted her because he did a search of the name Olsrud on Facebook. He found her, and he said that he lived on the land where there was a lake called Olsrud Lake, and he wanted to know more about the history of that name. And she had been adopted, and her father, my brother, had passed away, and she didn't know anything about the family history. So she contacted me, and I sent the man, I got his email address and sent him the chapter of the book about the Olsrud immigrants. And he sent me this picture of the sign he made. He said he thought that people going by his farm should know the name of the lake. So that's nice to have that attractive sign identifying the name that was my name until I was married. And if you noticed on the book, I signed my name as Rhoda Elaine Olsrud Mackenzie. I included my middle name too, because I was known as Elaine the first 6 years of my life until I went to school, and then I was known as Rhoda. So that's basically my story. I don't expect anyone else to create a book in quite the way I did, but now I call the Olsrud book my surname book.
Very interesting.
Were there minimums for publishing numbers of books and things like that?
They didn't, I don't remember, it was quite a few years ago. I don't remember if they gave me a minimum, but when I said I wanted 35 copies, that seemed to be satisfactory to them. And most people did ask how much it cost and reimbursed me. And I think at that time I estimated about $35 a copy. I'm sure it would be more now.
You mentioned that the publisher said something like they didn't normally do it that way. What was the way they normally did it?
Well, I don't know anything about publishing, but they have their own equipment, and when you get a book, it looks different from what you just print out from your computer. So whatever the process is, it's different from just printing out what you write.
So you were able to put it in a Word file, whatever.
Yeah, I did it in WordPerfect.
Okay, and then you did page after page after page.
Yeah.
And then the printer then sort of took this apart and put it in a format that they can print on these larger sheets and stuff, or?
Well, they didn't print on large sheets. It's the size that I made, but the thing was that as I formatted it on my computer, you can use the horizontal format and then divide it in two. And so that's the way I thought page one, page two. But when they bound it, they had to reorganize it. I'm not quite sure how that works, but
Okay.
anyway, it was a bit of work for the publisher. And then one thing I didn't mention was that we put all the photographs together, because if I put them in, scattered throughout the text, it would have cost a lot more. They had to use a higher quality paper in order to get the photographs to look good. So I decided to call it a family picture album.
So, on the pages that you printed the pictures on, it was a different quality of more calcium or
Well,
something?
that's what the printer told me, that oh, I just hold up the book, the
Uh-huh.
pages are just you can't really tell that they're
Yeah.
different paper, but they said it was better quality paper.
That's a smart way to do it, yeah.
I had a book written by a neighbor of mine, and she grew up in Grand Forks County, North Dakota. And I enjoyed reading the book myself, and I offered it up to the University of North Dakota library, and they snapped it up just because it occurred in that county.
Well, I could tell one more story. Then I had an older sister, Lois, who helped me quite a bit with contacting people and doing some follow-up interviews. She was a librarian at the University of Arizona. And when she died, well, actually, when she retired, the head librarian had a scholarship fund, an endowment established in her name for library scholarships. And so she was fairly well known there. And when she died, my niece went down to Tucson to help clear out her apartment, found she had 2 copies of the book. So she asked another retired librarian if the university might like a copy. And the woman took it to the university, and they did put it in a special collection there. So recently, my niece, who lives in the Minneapolis area, sent me an email with a copy of, she had done a search in the library and found that book listed. So my book is listed in an actual library.
Fun.
Yeah. There are a couple of comments from Donna that the Library of Congress genealogy room wants contributions like this, and I think
Yeah, I could say something about that. I did a lot of research down there. They did have a family history research room at that time. I don't think they do anymore, but I did ask them if they would be interested, and they are interested in my great-grandfather's book. I said, do you want the original? I hate to give it up, but they said they'd rather have the one that I did because the paper would last longer on that kind of paper. The old books are crumbling. But when it comes to the Olsrud surname book, they don't want books that mention people who are still living. So I would have to redo it and just do the
Oh,
first
wow.
few chapters on the my parents' generation and the earlier ancestors, and leave out the section on my generation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
she also comments that Politics and Prose helps people publish their books.
Oh,
So
really? Oh,
there's a possibility.
yeah, I didn't know that.
So I think we'll